keeping our technology theme, we've got artificial intelligence. So I'll pass over to Mark. Thank you.
I don't think I'm artificial, but I know I'm not. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the third in a series of articles that I've written in the Australian Tax Forum. The one I'm talking about today is in the most recent edition. I was going to talk about my current project, but Brett's reaction to my initial email made me think, no, maybe I'll ask him something a little bit safer. Okay, so these three articles are written from a kind of information theoretical perspective, leading really towards kind of normative tax theory, so trying to reform the tax system, really. The article I'm going to be talking about is particularly in relation to AI tax policy. The context for the article in question, the AI article, is the fact that billions of dollars are being invested by both governments and the private sector in AI. And it's, I think, important, given the per capita difference of investment by the federal government in Australia. I think it's imperative that we get on that bandwagon and we encourage, to the extent that we can, the private sector to start investing. And of course, it's important that we develop those capabilities and those competencies here in Australia, because it's not enough to uptake AI technologies when they're being developed somewhere else, because somebody else will own those technologies and we will necessarily fall behind. So we really need to be developing those capabilities here in Australia. And really that's kind of the background behind this particular article. And I suppose the other background to it really does kind of feed into what Neil was saying. Neil was talking about individuals during their working lives, so not children, not other people, during their working lives having to overproduce. But of course, advanced manufacturing, which AI is called, of course, an important part, does suggest that maybe even people at working age may not have the opportunity to work in the future. So it's quite an important area for us to start thinking about, well, how do we provide for people who may be made unemployed just by virtue of the fact that most of the machines are doing the production rather than people. So another reason why we should try and jump on the AI bandwagon here in Australia. So the theory that underlines these three articles is, again, a perspective I describe as the new knowledge approach to taxation. Underlying that is the idea that it is only knowledge, only new knowledge, that secures economic growth. Economic growth. So when you talk about economies of scale, that's just a form of new knowledge. You know, to make things differently, use different knowledge to make more stuff. The competitiveness literature, the economics literature is quite clear that it is new knowledge, although they do tend to focus on new scientific knowledge, as does the R&D tax credit that we have here in many other countries. Those literature streams do make it quite clear that it is only really new knowledge that can ensure economic growth for the long term. And even when you have sort of small technical efficiencies in production, that is also based on sort of new knowledge. It's just small new knowledge rather than sort of big production frontier moving knowledge. So one of the reasons that I have advanced this new knowledge approach to taxation is really because of a theory coming out of fundamental physics from Oxford of David Deutsch, who has produced a definition of knowledge. So hitherto we've been a bit vague in terms of our definition of knowledge is justified true belief or some variant thereof. But as a result of David Deutsch's work, there is some emerging idea that knowledge could be thought about as transformative information. The idea that any kind of blueprint that helps to produce an artifact, helps to produce something, you know, in economics we call it sort of goods and services, but you know, if you're not in that space, then the idea of an artifact is the idea of something produced by an individual, something manufactured by an individual, by a machine. So yeah, so this new definition of knowledge helps to make the new knowledge approach to taxation doable. before, knowledge has been a bit iffy, it's been a bit sort of conceptually difficult to get a handle on. But I think that this kind of new idea of knowledge as a form of information, hence the information theory sort of perspective or paradigm, means that this new approach to thinking about taxation is actually doable. The second theoretical perspective really is about the whole of life idea, the idea that we should be incentivising whole of life. Hitherto, the literature, particularly the philosophical and the economics literature, has suggested that ex-ante subsidies are the best. However, I think rational choice theory, I think the idea that people are not really very good at taking into account all of the information when making decisions, because there's a lot of noise out there. Plus, we have limited ability to take out information when we make decisions. So I think that really has meant that we have moved away conceptually from thinking about ex-ante subsidies, so grants. We're no longer thinking it's just that grants are the best way to subsidise market players. So that leads me to this idea of a whole of life perspective for incentivisation. So that includes ex-ante grants, includes during the project, which includes something like the R&D tax credit, and something after the project, so ex post. So, for example, the patent box is a good example of an ex post incentive. So, yeah, trying to bring that whole of life perspective into incentivising the Australian economy, or the market players in the Australian economy, to invest and develop AI competences. So what's the solution then? What do I come up with in this article? Obviously the grants thing, it's not really a tax thing, but I do go through some of the grant suggestions and some of the grants that have already been put forward by the federal government. But from a tax perspective, I conceptualise an AI tax credit. I don't think we can use the R&D tax credit for the purposes of incentivising AI, mostly because at the very heart of the R&D tax credit is this idea of the incentivising new scientific knowledge. And it's not that that's the aim, it's more that the methodology that the R&D tax credit adopts, which is the idea of scientific exploration or scientific experimentation, is not really apposite to the whole AI thing. AI is really a bit of software. We don't really know what it does when it runs. It's a bit of a black box phenomenon. So we don't know how it comes to the decisions it comes to. We can't ask it questions because we're not at that state of evolution yet with AI. So you cannot really talk about the development of new knowledge by AI as being something that is methodologically similar to the sort of physical sciences and the experimentation therein, which is what the R&D tax credit relies on. So I've basically come up with a new idea for how we should incentivise AI through a standalone tax credit. So that's during the life of the project. And then after the project, so ex post, I talked a little bit about the patent box. So we have evidence of patent boxes that are extant, so already existing, that AI is within the frame of those types of development incentive. So there is therefore scope to extend Australia's patent box to include AI from that point of view. As you probably know, the current idea for the patent box in Australia is quite limited to certain sectors. So that obviously affects the AI development in other sectors. But I still think it's possible to extend that to AI more generally. But another thing that comes out from the literature is the idea that as an ex post incentive, patent boxes are not necessarily the only game in town, and that's partly because of trade secrets. So what you see, and Elon Musk famously said, yeah, of course we don't apply for patents because all we do is we provide China with a recipe book to do what we're doing. So there's a lot of companies, a lot of corporations, a lot of market actors who don't use patents in terms of their own new knowledge, R&D, research and innovation, and therefore I have an alternative to the patent box, if they're going that way, which I have referred to as the AI box. unimaginatively. And the AI box, again, follows through with a conceptualization of how we should incentivize post-development the AI investments. And what I do is I specifically target 3 areas, which is the software itself. Difficult to get tax credits for software development, as you know. The hardware, necessary. I focus a little bit on the article on quantum computing as kind of the way forward for managing the kinds of data that current AI need. And also data acquisition, data training, that kind of thing. So there are 3 areas that I focus on in terms of the actual incentivization. So, yeah. So we've got, as ex post, we've got these 2 alternatives. You can either go the payment box route, or you can go the AI box route. One's sort of under the radar, and one's out there for everyone to see. Okay, I think probably a good conclusion is really to sort of end where I started, which is just to remind everyone that, at the moment we're worrying about, retirement, but what happens if we're all kind of forced into retirement during working age? And I think that, it'll be good for the countries that have the advanced manufacturing, that have the handle on all of the AI technologies. They'll be able to overproduce, and they'll be able to distribute wealth from a governmental redistributional perspective. But the countries that aren't ahead of the game, at that time, what do? And that's really the rationale behind me pushing this kind of AI agenda on the Australian economy and on the federal government, and asking the question, what do we do if we aren't developing those capabilities and we're not in a good position later on to support our citizenry? Okay, thank you very much.